The job for today is to fit a new fuel pump into this Hummer H2. There's been a strong smell of fuel coming from the rear left-hand wheel, and it's probably due to the common fuel pump problem where the top of the fuel pump rots and the fuel leaks out, plus the fact I keep getting the warning messages, tighten fuel cap, and then we get the occasional error, which is a large Evap error. The plan is to fit a new fuel pump, and here we have an ACDelco MU1423, which I finally managed to get one that didn't get broken in transit. And things that got broken with these two little plastic lugs here. 3 times it happened. Eventually I got one that was in one piece. The plan is to jack the Hummer up off the floor as high as I can. I don't have the luxury of having ramps or a pit to working or anything like that, which is a bit of a hindrance, but we're going to put it up as, I think we can probably get it a foot on each corner of the vehicle, which should be enough for me to get the fuel tank out. Next stage is to disconnect the battery just to make sure, and then put the car up as high as possible on wooden blocks. The Hummer is now in the air. It's about 12 inches off on each corner. Now maybe I should have put this at the start of the video, but I have had a look over the top of the fuel tank. But the litmus test for me was running my finger around the lip of the fuel pump and could smell the fuel on my fingers. So I'm pretty sure that there is some kind of fuel leak around there. And as I mentioned before, it's pretty much a given that when you've got a few smells coming around from the rear left-hand side where the fuel tank is, you may have a fuel tank problem. The next stage will be to disconnect the filler hose from the back of the tank, take the under protective cover. I think there are 3 bolts for that, and then there are some straps which hold the fuel tank up. I'm going to try and drain out as much fuel as I can to lighten the load. There's not a lot in there, but obviously that's got to come out. Then the plan is to take the tank out, clean the tank, remove the old pump, and then clean out the tank, refit the new pump, and then put it all back together. Underneath the vehicle we have the fuel tank guard, and there is a bolt here, and there is a bolt here. I don't know if you can see that. And there's another one just up there, and I think those 3 release the cover, so we're going to try and do those. I haven't pre-prepped them with penetrating oil yet, but we'll do that, and then we'll undo the bolts. According to someone else, there is something holding this at this corner over here. I just can't see what it is. Someone said they had to drill off the 2 rivets that were holding the side of the fuel tank cover. It is actually something like an M6 bolt on the top. The skid guard is supporting in 4 places, and I couldn't imagine in the design there'd only be 3 support points. So this nut has now been cleaned up and screws on and off by hand. We will grease it before we put it on there just to give it some protection. So that's the skid cover back to normal. Remember, you don't need to drill the sides out. The fuel pump sits in the fuel tank in this orientation. So you've got 2 electrical connectors. I guess this is the main fuel line. I'm not quite sure what these are. On mine, this is broken off. This is just literally rotted away, and I'm now faced with the problem of pulling out the broken part out of the hose, but I haven't got the electrical connectors off yet. Somehow I've got to get these off, but I haven't got that far yet. The fuel tank is in the vehicle, suspended, and I will show you how to make a makeshift suspension to drop the tanks on, because I don't have room to put chairs or jacks or anything else underneath. But before I do so, I'm now faced with disconnecting these three things. This one's broken off, and as soon as I've done that, I can pull the tank out. You can see lying on the floor the two straps that support the tank. If you undo those straps and drop them down, they do just twist off. That you don't need to bend them. I've seen videos where people bend them out the way, which seems a bit catastrophic. There's no need to do that. You can keep them intact. They're a little bit rusty, but I'm not going to change them for the moment. Now, to support the tank, I've used rope. There's natural grooves around the tank where you can tie some rope, and you can use the rope to actually lower the tank down in sections. So it's quite useful way of being able to support the tank. I'm now trying to disconnect all of the lines from my tank so we can drop it out. It's very difficult to see what we're doing now, so mainly done by feel, I suspect. I forgot to mention that to protect the tank, where the fuel inlet hose connects to, I just covered that up to stop any debris falling inside and getting inside the tank. After a series of issues, I managed to get the fuel tank down on the ground. So you can see the top of the fuel pump is well rotted. It's in a real bad state. And the connectors, this connector, you need a screwdriver behind. This one you can undo by hand. The actual fuel line just twisted off. This line rotted off. So that's where the smells were coming from. So for the moment we have the fuel tank out, and once you know, in the UK it's now starting to rain. Typical. We're going to continue to drain the fuel out of it. I do have fuel in here, I know I do. I'm going to try and drain out as much as possible before I start trying to remove the fuel pump module. As you can see underneath, I had a series of ropes which I use for lowering it down. It's quite easy really. With the aid of an electric fuel pump, I managed to drain and siphon off all of the last fuel in the tank. I'd estimated that the remaining content of the tank was about 35 litres. In actual fact it was 30 litres. That was based roughly on the fuel gauge setting and the maximum capacity, so I was very close. I've cleaned up the fuel tank as much as possible. I've cleaned particularly around the area here, but every time you touch it some rust falls off, so we're never going to get rid of it all. I've cleaned around these. I've managed to break my Evap connector here. I'm going to have to look at see if there's somewhere we can repair that somehow, because they're hard to get hold of. It's only got to work just one time just to get it on there and just hold. So we may be able to do something with that, I don't know. I've managed to get the lock ring off. I used a brass bar to reduce the chances of sparks. Use just a regular hammer. It's more of the shock than it is of the force, and I'm not quite sure if it was the hammer or the overnight soak in penetrating oil which made it move, but as soon as I used the hammer it was much easier. Just tap straight off. And don't be confused when you look down on the lock ring on the top. You'll see there's one segment that looks like it's got something in it. That is the fuel pump flange. Don't be confused by that. I've brushed off as much of the debris as possible on the top. I'm just going to get a cloth and wipe that down before I pull out the pump. I've cleaned the lock around the lock ring area. We won't be using this lock ring again. This one's going to go to the scrap heap. So the next stage is to pull out this pump. Now it's not been lifted out before. And the other thing to remember is to protect the little locking flanges around the pump. You don't want to damage those because they're part of the tank. You can see even as I try to lift it. Here we go. This is the first time this pump will have been out since it was manufactured, since the Hummer was built. Eventually I managed to get the pump out. Now I had to use a little screwdriver just there. But there are three kind of plastic locking bits. Maybe the plastic's expanded over the years. But anyway, it's out. This is where the locking tab goes for the fuel pump. That's the orientation that it goes in. Now, you can see there are particles of rust actually in there. With the best will in the world, it's going to be impossible with a rusty pump not to drop some bits in. I'm going to vacuum around the top here just to get the last particles off, but then we're going to have to carefully remove as much debris from inside as possible. The bottom of the tank is, or the inside of the tank is a kind of milky colour. It's not actually any sediment, it's just the way that the tank is. I don't think it's a sediment. Little locking flanges tend to be a little bit rusty. I'm going to try and show you. See, you can actually get some rust off the whole ring. So I'm going to carefully go around and remove as much rust as possible. Well, I've cleaned up around the locking ring. I'm still not 100% happy with the actual finish that I've got on there, but it would be good enough apart from the debris inside the tank. Probably will end up painting this. They've been brushed with a brass wire brush, making sure that none of the particles get inside the tank. I've masked off the entire area, and the next stage is to clean it with isopropyl alcohol to degrease the surface of the metal, and then we're going to spray it with Hammerite direct to rust metal paint. Yeah, it's just literally 1 hour drying time, so that'll be the next stage. This is a bit of an issue. The evap line from the fuel pump broke off, and you can see it's very rusty inside, and somehow I've got to try and get that rusty bit out. The problem is there's nothing to grab hold of, and it's just as rusty as anything. But at the moment I'm just removing all of the rusty debris from out of the pipe, and it also worries me that it's going to go down the evap tube, so I'm trying to keep the tube vertical through this exercise so that I can just flush out any rusty particles that are in there. I'm not quite sure how readily available new pipes and stuff is, but this is quite a setback. To release the inner ring, you press, can you see if I press the top, that white band on the top there will release the connector. Now, by just grabbing hold of the rusty bit and a little bit of penetrating oil just to release, get it to rotate first of all, and then release that band and it pulls out. It's not that difficult. I've also got to deal with this broken evap connector, which I've got a plan for. That pipe has now been cleaned and it's pretty good. I think I've got all the debris out of the pipe, so quite happy with that. It is possible to remove the evap locking ring from the end of the pipe. To do this, you'll notice there are little barbs on the edge of that latch, and they just push in and lock in place. So you just need to push a pin down these two slots here. Just use a flat blade and it will pop out. I needed to do that so that I can take this and repair that end there, which I'm going to go and try and do now. Well, I've tried to repair the little locking clasp, and I've hot welded the plastic using a soldering iron. Dragged as much material over from bits of the plastic that aren't used, like this kind of grip here, and just dragged it over and tried to make a new web. It seems fairly strong. I'm going to put it back together. It's got to be better than it was. Here is the completed end with a little springy thing on there, and I think that should hold. It's pretty solid, not a lot else I can do, but it's good news that you could actually take this clip out the end there and replace that, replace just this part if you wanted to. So you can leave this in place. Looking down, the O-ring looks very good, nice and clean, so that should be fine. Here is the locking lugs which have been sprayed. They've had 4 coats of black hammerite, and somewhere we have a locking ring. So what we need to do is to make sure that the locking ring still fits, and as you can see, it had no effect on the actual locking ring. In fact, the fuel pump seals against an O-ring which sits in that groove there, so that's going to press down on the fuel pump to make the seal, and this is just going to lock it in place, so we just end up tapping that into place. So I've prepared the Evap ends. They're nice and clean, ready to go. I'm going to put those in bags to seal them up, and then we're going to wash out the tank to make sure there's no debris. In my opinion, the tank is now clean inside. You can check around. Apart from having an endoscope and going around inside, you're never going to know. The place where the straps go on the tank put natural indents in the tank, so when your fuel runs low, you've already got some fuel left in the tank. You never get right down to empty. There's always a bit there. I found having a nice clean hand and just going around inside and just feeling, you can see if you've got anything in the tank, any particles. You know, your fingers are so tactile and sensitive, and that's as good as indication as any that your tank is clean. But I'm going to leave this tank to dry now. It's pretty dry already. I'm going to leave it an hour or two, and then we'll start fitting the fuel pump in. As with the Evap line, the fuel line broke off the fuel pump module. Now I know you just press these little white clips to get them off. That's how you pull the glands off, but that wouldn't have come off anyway because there's rust inside, so you can't even press that off. The other end was nice and clean. That just popped straight off. So I'm going to repair this line, and then we're ready to fit the fuel pump module. The fuel line has now been cleaned up, both ends. I've sat the fuel pump module in there. Noticed that it's actually sprung against the bottom of the tank, and that the tab is just here. Actually says tab in the plastic, so that's the way that it goes. You can see that it wants to line up with the Evap line. All the hoses are there. Here is the fully prepared tank. All of the pipes are pushed back into their clips along the tank. You can see that they've left their match marks where they originally put this in the factory. A little yellow line on there to show where they were. I've put protective covers over all of the ports, connectors, fuel line and Evap. So that's ready to go into a complete module. The bags will just pull off once we've got it into place. So everything's clipped on.